He paused for a moment, clearing his throat. The first thing you need to know is, I'm not from this time. I'm not from a time where everything was alright. Where anything made any sense. I come from a time of strife. From a place of absolute horror. I'm from the future. Oh, come on. Somebody shouted. Fuck off, you expect us to believe something like that? Kane didn't flinch at the outburst. He just continued speaking. It's a substantial assertion, I understand that, he said. One that requires proof behind it. He reached into his pocket, taking out a small, rectangular device that almost looked like a pistol magazine. He pointed the device at the ground, before firing off some sort of projectile. It looked like a metal circle, quickly expanding upwards and forming what almost looked like a large oval-shaped mirror. But I have the proof with me, he said. I'll show you the future. The glassy substance within the mirror began morphing, before we all found ourselves looking at an unfathomable scene. At that point, I had to wonder if I'd been hallucinating the whole thing. Perhaps this was one long, visceral fever dream. From CIA conspiracies to alien robots to some alleged time traveler that I vaguely recognized, none of it could possibly be real. But if that was the case, then why wasn't I waking up? I continued staring at whatever was unfolding in front of me. What was supposedly our future? It looked like Earth, but just barely. It wasn't even apocalyptic in the traditional sense. It almost looked like another world entirely. There was a forest, but the trees seemed to be much larger than they should have been. As I looked closer, I realized that the wood was covered in veins and that the leaves had teeth, biting at these bird-like creatures that flew a bit too close. The mountains in the back had thick black smoke billowing out from the peaks, while a gargantuan entity lurked behind them, its colossal tendrils wrapped around the base. Grotesque creatures larger than airplanes populated the neon sky, while the lake below seemed to bubble with the activity of obscured monstrosities. It may be hard to accept, but it's the truth. This is a recording of our future, Kane said. I was sent back with one purpose and one purpose only. To prevent this at any cost. We need a united population, he continued. The way the world is right now, with its superpowers at odds and countries locked in perpetual conflict won't cut it. And it's only going to get worse from here. We won't be ready for the real invasion. We need a unifying event to save us. I could have guessed that that's where he was going with it. You can hate what I've done. It's justified. I understand. But just know that all of my efforts have been for the greater good. I wasn't quite sure what to think. Kane spoke with an air of confidence that couldn't have been denied. His words had conviction behind them, his tone unfaltering the entire way through. The evidence he was presenting was also undeniably significant. Was he right? Were we on track for a future as horrific as the one he was showing us? Could it be helped if we joined him? As convincing as it all seemed to be, there was one thing that I couldn't shake. A feeling deep within my psyche that told me all of this was wrong. That the man standing in front of us was absolutely not to be trusted. Where had I recognized him from? On top of everything else, this was starting to drive me crazy. Kane began walking around, intently scanning our group, looking for a shift in attitude. I know it feels like I've betrayed you all, and I'm sorry for it, he said. But there are some things that simply need to be done. Soon enough, he made his way over to me and stopped. Had he recognized me first? A new recruit? He said, looking down at me. I suppose I don't have the same kind of history with you. I'm sure everything your comrades have told you about me came from a noble place. But I'm just trying to save life as we know it for the future generations. What do you think? Are you with me? I looked up at him, staring into his eyes directly for the first time. And that's when I figured it out. I realized where I'd recognized him from. It was unmistakable. One of his eyes had likely been injured in the past, leaving nothing but a milky white behind. The sight of it had triggered a memory so repressed in the back of my mind that I hadn't thought about in years. I nodded my head. Yeah. I'll join you. Kane got down on a knee, getting eye level with me. You're sure? He asked. This is important, I responded. I want to fight for the future. He smiled. I could tell that he hadn't recognized me at all. Thank you, my friend, he said. Soon enough, you'll know that your decision was the right one. What the hell are you doing? I heard Armin shout. This is a trap. He's not telling you the truth. I ignored him, continuing to look forward instead. Kane went ahead and loosened my restraints, before holding his hand out to me. I accepted and he pulled me up to my feet, patting me on the back. Your descendants will thank you? He said. I stepped past him, walking towards the strange mirror world. Can I ask you a question? I said. Of course, Kane replied, walking over to me. Why can't you remember me? Before his expression could even register the confusion, I grabbed him by the neck and sent us both crashing into the mirror. We fell through, hitting dirt as we did so. As I'd expected, he wasn't showing us a recording of the future at all. This was something else entirely. As we scrambled on the ground, I saw the device fly out from his pocket, landing on the ground a few feet away. This also ended up closing the portal entirely. No! Kane screamed. What the hell have you done? I leapt up and tried grabbing the device but was pulled back down and slammed by Kane. He really was strong. But I couldn't let him win. We continued to fight, although it gradually devolved into a one-sided beatdown. I may have bitten off more than I was able to chew with this guy. He ended up cracking me across the jaw with a vicious elbow, which caused me to black out for just a moment. I fell to the ground, stars now littering my vision. Kane stood over me, his face twisted into a spiteful grimace. Who the fuck are you? He asked. I really couldn't believe that he didn't remember. What was one of the most disturbing moments in my entire life must have been par for the course for him. My encounter with Kane happened early in my career, back when I was a little bit more optimistic about my future. I was in France, where I'd just been paid for a contract and was riding high on my emotions. I just needed a few more paydays and I'd be good. Then I could move on to bigger and better things. I was walking through Paris at night, enjoying the crisp breeze and a nice expensive cigar. At one point, I turned into a completely empty street, which is where I saw her. It was a young girl, maybe in her early 20s, walking by herself. Something that wouldn't have been a cause for concern on its own, but the details made it quite alarming. She seemed to be wearing nothing but a torn hospital gown, and her movements were frenetic, almost as if she wasn't quite sure where she was going. She soon spotted me and began running over. I backed up just a bit, unsure of what to expect from something like this. Perhaps she posed no physical threat to me, but any and all risk was better off avoided. In any case, I eased up as she got closer. She looked to be in extreme distress. She began speaking to me, her words coming out in a rapid and jumbled mess. My French wasn't great to begin with, so trying to decipher what she was saying proved to be quite the task. However, I could make out a few key phrases. Help me please, and save my brother. She grabbed my arm and began pulling me, trying to get me to follow her. I was hesitant at first, but ultimately relented. I knew that this could end horribly for me, but the idea of being the hero gave me hope for some kind of catharsis. Maybe I could wash away all of the morally ambiguous things I've done with one act of altruism. I really did think that was how the world worked back then. Eventually, she led me to what must have been the most decrepit building in the darkest corner of Paris. A place that looked so uninviting, even the most daring of ghost hunters would have avoided it. The basement, she said, looking up at me with teary eyes and a petrified expression. She really must have experienced something horrifying in there. He's in the basement. Please hurry. Against my better judgment, I went in. The place looked like it might have been a store at one point, but I couldn't have been too sure. The smell of mold lingered in the dusty air as I walked, hand gripping my pistol as I searched for a door leading down. It didn't take me long to find it, and I began traversing down the rickety wooden steps, trying to make sure that I wouldn't get clocked in the back of the head with an axe once I got down. I ended up in a hallway, which felt strange, since it didn't line up with the rest of the building's aesthetics. This place looked newer and relatively well maintained, as if it were actually still being used for something. I got to the end of the passage, where a locked door was waiting for me. I went ahead and kicked it down, revealing an even stranger sight beyond. Another hallway, this time with metal doors and windows on either side. At this point, I began tensing up. It felt as if I was seeing something that I really wasn't supposed to be. Most of the rooms were empty, evident from the fact their lights were off and I couldn't see anything inside. There was only one that wasn't. Light poured into the hallway from one window near the end. I remember my arms shaking as I got within a few steps, feeling the pressure in the air getting heavier every time I inched forward. And then I looked inside. Through the window, I could see a bloody operating table with a young boy strapped to it. His stomach was opened up and it looked like a few of his organs had been removed and replaced with some mechanical counterpart. And then, the man who was operating on him came into view. His face had been blurred out in my memory for so long, but I was seeing him clearly now. He was standing in front of me, both in my mind and in real life. He saw me looking at him and gave me a sinister grin. One that was equal parts smug and sadistic. It was as if me stumbling upon his operation wouldn't be a problem for him in the slightest. I could feel my arms raising instinctively, my mind screaming at me to shoot and kill him. I could tell that I was looking at an extremely dangerous individual. I fired off 3 or 4 bullets through the glass, all of them hitting the man square in the forehead. But instead of dropping to the ground, his grin just grew wider. It almost looked inhuman. As if there wasn't actually a man there at all. Just a primal force of destruction. I remember backing up slowly, my limbs completely stiff from the shock. The man opened the door and stepped out, approaching me in a way that was disturbingly nonchalant. I tried getting up and running, but I didn't make it too far. I blacked out after only a few steps and woke up some indeterminable amount of time later, face first in the grass and dirt. My head was pounding as I got up, finding myself standing in a park near the hotel I was staying at. My phone and wallet were still in my pocket, so I checked the time to see that it was 9 a.m. the next day. For the longest time, I couldn't tell if what I'd experienced was real or not. Eventually, I settled on the latter. I thought it was better to just delude myself than consider the alternative. However, I remembered one thing very clearly from that night. I knew exactly where the building was. The one that the girl had led me to. I almost didn't want to do it, but I knew that I had to. I needed to go back to that building and see what was really there. So that's what I did. I ventured all the way back down those streets, feeling my unease mounting every time I got closer. I could almost see that girl running in front of me again. If all of this was real, then where was she now? Eventually, I made it back to the spot where the building was, half expecting it to not be there at all. But that wasn't the case. It was still there, now sealed off by police tape. The cops who were guarding the place eyed me curiously as I walked past. I almost considered asking them what had happened in there, but decided it was best not to.